Today we're going to talk about a major misstep by Josh Hawley in his attempt to save face after helping incite an insurrection, why Twitter was absolutely right to ban Trump, and my interview with the lawyer who beat Trump and his allies in more than 60 court cases, Mark Elias, where we talk about whether the insurrectionists could be charged with sedition, along with Trump, Don Jr., and Rudy Giuliani, and whether Trump could pardon himself and whether it would hold up in court. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. So here's where we're at. Before the insurrection, a bunch of power-hungry Republicans thought that repeating the lie that the election was stolen from Trump would be a good launching pad for their own presidential runs. And so Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley became the faces of this disinformation campaign in the Senate. And they validated Trump's big lie, only to watch that lie then pave the way for an insurrection at the Capitol. It was not well received. Trump and the Republican Party's approval ratings plummeted, with Trump now standing at an all-time low of 29% approval as he's leaving office. There are calls for Hawley and Cruz to resign from the Senate, which they won't, along with calls for them to be expelled. So clearly, a major miscalculation from some Republicans who were banking on sedition being their key to power. But now, rather than admit fault because we'd be more likely to watch the sun envelop the solar system, Hawley has penned an op-ed in the Columbia Daily Tribune, digging in his heels and defending his decision to object to the election results. And here's the excuse he gave, which is an excuse that I've seen all over conservative social media, and it's this, quote, "Dozens of Democratic members of Congress have lodged objections in precisely the same forum over the last 3 decades. To be specific, Democrats objected to the elections of 2000, 2004, and 2016. In other words, every time Republicans won the White House in the last 30 years, and they were within their rights to do so, the joint session is the forum where concerns about an election can be raised, debated, and ultimately resolved with a vote." Real quick, before I get to the Democratic objections, I want to respond to this idea that all this was just some innocent debate. That is bullshit, and Josh Hawley knows that. This was already litigated to within an inch of its life. The idea that the election was rigged or invalid at all was shot down in 64 court cases. It was shot down at the DOJ, DHS, by Republican governors, Republican secretaries of state, and recounts and audits confirmed it. And beyond that, Axios reported that Trump started choreographing how he would declare victory regardless of the outcome in October. This entire thing was decided months ago. According to Axios, Reince Priebus admitted that Trump called in October and, quote, acted out his script, including walking up to a podium and prematurely declaring victory on election night if it looked like he was ahead. And he knew it would look like he was ahead because in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Republicans wouldn't allow mail-in votes to be counted until after the election day votes that would favor Trump already came in. So the point of this wasn't to get to the bottom of anything. It was to continue the work of sowing doubt in the system. That was the big lie, and Josh Hawley knows that because he's not an idiot. But by using this as an excuse, he's proving that he thinks all of us are. But back to the Democratic objections that Hawley wrote about. Now, he's right. Democrats did object after the elections of 2000, 2004, and 2016. So let's talk about them. In 2000, a few House Democrats objected to the certification for the state of Florida because they claimed that black voters had been disenfranchised. Not a fake claim of stolen elections because of deep state actors and nefarious voting systems vendors, which don't exist, but voter disenfranchisement, which actually does exist. And yet still, there was no Democratic senator to join in on the objection, so the certification process carried on from there. That's it, a 20-minute delay. In 2004, Democratic lawmaker Stephanie Tubbs Jones from Ohio, along with Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer, objected to Ohio certification because of voter irregularities in the sense that, again, voters were being disenfranchised. In 2004, there was the disqualification of provisional ballots, the alleged misallocation of voting machines, and disproportionately long lines in poor and predominantly black communities. Does that sound familiar? Hawley is trying to equate very real voter suppression with Donald Trump's temper tantrum about Cuba, China, and Venezuela conspiring to oust him from office. And finally, in 2016, yes, 7 Democratic lawmakers objected, but no senators joined them, and there was no debate, and the certification process continued. And those objections were largely centered around voter suppression and Russian interference. And guess what? There was voter suppression and there was Russian interference. And yet still the objections were nothing more than a few minutes of delay. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that despite Hawley's attempt to equate Democratic objections that were born out of legitimate grievances with Republican objections born out of a constantly debunked lie that nefarious forces from around the globe coordinated to steal the election from Trump, they are not the same by any stretch of the imagination. Democrats weren't objecting because of a coordinated disinformation campaign to willfully inspire half the country to distrust our free and fair elections. In the instances that they did object, it was because people were blocked from voting. Republicans like Hawley objected because too many people were allowed to vote, namely Democrats. That's not how this works. You don't get to object because you're mad that people were allowed to vote for someone who's not your candidate and then reverse engineer bullshit excuses to justify that. But that's what Hawley did. And as a result of that, a direct result, the people who they convinced to trust them then stormed the US Capitol in an insurrection for the first time in over 200 years. And that is why this was dangerous. That is why Trump should be convicted and not allowed to run again. That's why Hawley and Cruz and the rest of the Senate Republicans who perpetuated this disinformation campaign have no place in the Senate. That's why the GOP lawmakers who aided and abetted this insurrection obviously have no place in the House. That's why Trump and the rest of his Stop the Steal accomplices should be banned from Twitter and the rest of social media, because what they did was not normal debate, it was not being done in good faith, it was to incite a mob to kill politicians. And to focus on Twitter for a second here, this isn't about censorship. This isn't me wanting every conservative voice banned from Twitter. Honestly, I want Republicans on Twitter. Twitter would be a fundamentally different experience for me if I didn't have the ability to shit on Marco Rubio for being a spineless bowl of jello who's only capable of spouting Bible verses. I want that. But there is a big difference between free speech and what Trump and some of his enablers did, which was to coordinate a dangerous disinformation campaign that directly led to violence. And some on the right are claiming that Trump didn't participate in the violence and that he has a right to speak. And to that, I'd say this: your right to swing your fist ends when it meets my face. Donald Trump's right to inflame tensions and to use Twitter to do that doesn't just end with his tweets. It ended with people dying. It ended with Officer Brian Sicknick and 4 of his own supporters not being able to go home to their families. So when Republicans cry censorship, they are willfully and disingenuously pretending, operative word, pretending, to be ignorant about the context here. And the context is important. And that context is that you could draw a straight line from the claims that Trump has peppered his supporters with on a daily basis over the course of months, and the violence that occurred because his supporters needed to vindicate him as a direct result of those claims. He claimed a stolen election. The rally that led to the insurrection was literally called the Stop the Steal rally. There's no doubt here. And so everything that we talk about that was born out of these events, be it Trump getting banned on Twitter, or conservatives decrying cancel culture, or Trump's impeachment, or the impending Senate trial, they all have to consider the inciting incident, because they were all born out of the big lie, where Trump knowingly and willfully lied about an election being stolen that was objectively, factually, indisputably not stolen. And any argument in defense of Trump that doesn't take the big lie into consideration isn't being had in good faith. And that includes Hawley's little op-ed where he tries to save face by pretending that the scheme he partook in was in any way normal or in any way followed precedent. It didn't. He'll try to normalize it, but it is anything but normal. He helped incite an insurrection, and no revisionist history is going to change that. Which brings me to my interview with the lawyer who actually beat Trump's campaign and allies in all of these post-election cases. To watch my interview with Mark Elias, where we talk about whether Trump, Don Jr., and Giuliani could be charged with insurrection, whether a self-pardon by Trump would hold up, and much more, check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. Now, before I go, I'll be live streaming the entirety of Joe Biden's inauguration on Wednesday, January 20th on YouTube. So if you're not yet subscribed to my channel, go ahead and subscribe. And then tune in on Wednesday to watch Joe Biden get sworn in. That's it for this episode. Talk to you next week.